Welcome to Rome. We're very glad to have you here today. Perhaps you could tell us why you're here and a little bit about your latest book.
Yes, well, I'm here for the wonderful Libri Come Festival. I'm here to promote my second novel, which is called The Storm at the Door. My first book was called The Story of Forgetting. Both novels deal with my family's history. In the first book, it was more of a traditional sort of novel, but in the second book, I consider it a sort of memoir fiction hybrid. It's about my grandparents who led somewhat mysterious and complicated lives. My grandfather died long before I was born. He died somewhat mysteriously in 1968 after having spent years in a very famous mental hospital, it's McLean Hospital, which happens to have been the most famous mental hospital in America at the time. It was home to Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, John Nash, who A Beautiful Mind is based off of. And he was something of a poet himself. But when I was 7 years old, my grandmother destroyed almost everything he had written. And so the novel is my attempt to recreate both his story and my grandmother's story from that turbulent time in the early 1960s. It opens as memoir, as a memory that I have as a child of watching her destroy these things, and then it goes into my imagination of what might have happened.
Thank you. I believe on Sunday at the auditorium you'll be speaking again about your latest book, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the influence of your family and what it's like to write about your family.
Yeah, in both of my first two books, it felt like I had to tell my family story before I could move on to something more purely imagined. And I don't know why that is exactly, but my own story feels so deeply bound to that history that I never fully understood. And so I think my first two books are an attempt to understand myself by understanding them in ways. I grew up very, very immersed in my family's, or submerged in my family's history. Immersed would be the wrong word.
You will emerge.
I will emerge. I'm presently emerging. Um, I, um, I, I was homeschooled as a child, so I spent my days in the sole company of my mother, and for a while my grandmother came to live with us too. My grandmother, when she moved in with us, she was in the mid stages of Alzheimer's disease, and so her neurological condition was something very present for me. But out of the strangeness of that condition came sort of glimpses of her past. She believed herself in many ways to still be living in her past. So her past became a present for me in a way that I think is somewhat rare. Also because I didn't go to school, and my social milieu as a child was just my family. And so I don't know. I think in the same way that in people and writers' first novels, they often they're often autobiographical, and they often depict the world from which they come. I come from Texas, it's true, but more truly, in some ways, I come from my family. I mean, that was really the center of my life for my entire childhood.
Interesting. I know in Italy there's a great family tradition as well, and both culturally and socially the bonds of family are hard to break and really, I think, influence all of us. Another thing I'd like to ask you is about the influence of your environment. I understand you were in Umbria at Santa Maddalena for some time in 2009, and I wanted to ask whether that environment affected your work and whether perhaps your present environment back in Texas might affect your next work.
Yeah, I'm very lucky to have spent two fellowships at the beautiful Santa Maddalena, which is on a hillside near Florence. I suppose that there perhaps is something somewhat Italian, I don't know, in my work. I think that my closeness to my mother certainly is familiar to a lot of Italians, and the way that I live within that history, I think, is perhaps more of a European mode. In America, there's this terrible tendency, I think, to get as far away from one's history and one's family as possible, and to this sort of myth that you can establish a life washed of that history as an individual. I think Europeans, and particularly Italians, tend to live among that history, and I certainly do. So perhaps that's why I found a readership here. As far as Santa Maddalena goes, I don't know that I'm necessarily channeling anything particularly Italian when I'm there, but it's a wonderful home for writers. It's everything that a writer requires of an environment. It has other interesting writers there, so there are wonderful conversations. There's always a broad range of nationalities represented and of sort of levels of experience. There'll be great famous older writers and younger writers who come from places I've never traveled to. And I think that in that separation from, and that distance from the place I grew up, so far from Texas and New York, where I've been living for the last few years, I feel oddly, maybe paradoxically, better able to describe the places I'm from, because when I remove the distractions of those ongoing realities from my life, I can maybe observe them with a little bit more objectivity. And so I think I write best there for those reasons, but also because it's, you know, maybe this is a little bit spiritualist or hokey, but when I'm there in those rooms where Bruce Chatwin and Michael Cunningham, Gregor von Razzori, all these great writers have worked, and I sit at the table and open my computer, you can't help but feel yourself channeling in some way, or at least feel like you have to produce something that will not be an entire disappointment to that tradition of great writing that has happened at that very seat. So yeah, it's a wonderful and lucky thing.
Wonderful. And just if I could end by asking you, you're a fairly young writer yourself, what advice might you have for other young writers starting out?
Go to law school, probably. You know, I think that writing is not a career choice, which maybe sounds a little bit snobby, but something I just believe to be absolutely true, that it's so difficult to sit there every day at your desk alone and force words and pages out of yourself, and then, you know, all the difficulties of trying to get oneself published and trying to find a readership and promoting yourself and then exposing yourself in a way that's often very uncomfortable. The only reason that anyone would ever write was because they absolutely had to. And so my advice to a young writer would be, only do it if you absolutely feel like you have to do it. But if you do feel like, you know, you can't, if everything else feels like a waste of time to you, if this feels like something absolutely vital to your future, then I would say treat that instinct very seriously. And try to simplify your life, as Thoreau said, so that you have only that as much as you can. I mean, take some easy job just to pay the bills, and clear for yourself a life where you can just write and write and write. I mean, ultimately, what makes someone publishable is just practice. I think every writer I know has thrown away many more books than they have even attempted to publish. So just lock the doors and write and write and write.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.